There is a type of person who, no matter how hard they try, can never quite belong in their own family, not because they're difficult or ungrateful, but because something in them refuses to pretend. They see what others won't name. They feel what the family has agreed not to feel. And eventually, the psychic cost of staying becomes greater than the terror of leaving. You know the moment I'm talking about, not the dramatic blow-up or the final conversation, the quiet accumulation before that. The way your body knows something is wrong before your mind will admit it. Contact that leaves you feeling hollowed out, dissociated for hours afterward. The sensation of your nervous system screaming danger while everyone around you performs normal. These aren't isolated incidents. They're evidence of something operating beneath the surface, an invisible architecture that decides who speaks and who stays silent, who's believed and who's pathologized, who gets to be human and who must be the problem. Most people think family estrangement is about conflict, a failure of forgiveness, a character defect in the person who leaves. The culture frames it as abandonment, as if choosing distance from people who harm you is somehow a moral failing, as if loyalty to blood should override loyalty to your own nervous system, your own sanity, your own life. But here's what shifts everything. 27% of Americans are currently estranged from at least one family member, more than 1 in 4. This is not a fringe phenomenon. It's a hidden epidemic we've collectively agreed not to discuss. And among those who've created distance, 80% report positive outcomes. Freedom, clarity, the recovery of a self they didn't know existed. The question isn't why so many people leave their families. The question is, what are they leaving behind? Carl Jung discovered something that most psychology still refuses to fully acknowledge. Families aren't just social units, collections of individuals connected by blood and obligation. They're psychic fields, unconscious matrices where invisible forces assign roles, distribute emotional labor, and determine whose reality counts and whose gets erased. In these systems, someone must carry what everyone else refuses to acknowledge. The family's rage, its shame, its collective shadow, that someone is often you, the one who sees too clearly, the one who won't stay silent, the one whose honesty feels like betrayal because it threatens the structure holding everyone else's denial in place. You're not too sensitive, you're sensing accurately. You're not causing the dysfunction, you're revealing it. The family doesn't reject you because something is wrong with you. They reject you because your presence makes visible what they've spent decades keeping invisible. This video will show you the hidden mechanisms that make estrangement not abandonment, but survival. Not failure, but the beginning of individuation. The process Jung identified as becoming who you actually are, rather than who the family system needs you to be. We'll explore how families operate as unconscious systems, why certain members are chosen as scapegoats, what participation mystique means and why it keeps you fused to people who harm you, and what conscious separation actually requires. Because once you see the invisible architecture, you can't unsee it. And that's when the real work begins. That someone is often you, the one who sees too clearly, the one who won't stay silent, the one whose honesty feels like betrayal because it threatens the structure holding everyone else's denial in place. You're not too sensitive. You're sensing accurately. You're not causing the dysfunction. You're revealing it. The family doesn't reject you because something is wrong with you. They reject you because your presence makes visible what they've spent decades keeping invisible. This video will show you the hidden mechanisms that make estrangement not abandonment, but survival. Not failure, but the beginning of individuation. The process Jung identified as becoming who you actually are, rather than who the family system needs you to be. We'll explore how families operate as unconscious systems, why certain members are chosen as scapegoats, what participation mystique means, and why it keeps you fused to people who harm you, and what conscious separation actually requires. Because once you see the invisible architecture, you can't unsee it, and that's when the real work begins. To understand why you can't just get over your family, you need to understand what a family actually is. Not the greeting card version, not the social unit bound by legal ties and shared genetics. The psychological reality. A family is a psychic field, an unconscious matrix where invisible forces shape who you become before you have language to name what's happening to you. Jungian analyst Murray Stein describes it precisely. The child's psyche is largely contained within the parental psyche and reflective of it. You're not born as a separate psychological entity. You're born into your parents' inner world, their unresolved conflicts, their repressed desires, their unmetabolized trauma. And for the first years of life, you exist inside that world like a figure inside someone else's dream. This is not metaphor, it's mechanism. Jung distinguished between the actual parent, the physical person who feeds you, scolds you, tucks you in, and the parental imago. The imago is the internalized psychological representation of the parent, built partly from reality and partly from archetypal patterning in your own psyche. It's this internal figure, not the actual person, that continues to exert influence long after you've moved across the country or stopped speaking entirely. Stein observes what most people miss. It's not what the parent says that programs the child's inner world. It's what the parent is, what they do, the emotional atmosphere they generate. A parent can speak words of love while radiating contempt, can preach forgiveness while modeling vengeance. The child absorbs the truth beneath the performance, absorbs it through the unconscious, through introjection, through the simple fact of existing inside the parental psyche like a fish inside water. The family becomes your adaptive environment, and much of its emotional tone enters you without your consent, without your awareness, before you have an ego strong enough to say no. This is why leaving physically doesn't automatically free you psychologically. The family lives inside you. The roles, the prohibitions, the invisible agreements about what can be felt and what must be denied, all of it operates as an internal system even when the external family is hundreds of miles away or blocked on every platform. Jung called this the family complex, a cluster of emotionally charged images, memories, and patterns that behave like a small collective unconscious, organizing your responses, triggering your defenses, determining what feels safe and what feels like annihilation. No area of life generates more complexes than the family. Your complexes form when you're a child, absorbing the hidden conflicts between your parents, the secret worries, the repressed wishes that saturate the domestic environment like wallpaper you stop noticing but never stop breathing in. Here's what makes this devastating. Psychological birth is supposed to be separate from physical birth. Stein calls it the second birth, the moment the child's true individual personality emerges by leaving the parent's psyche and becoming a more truly separate entity, an autonomous self. In healthy development, this happens gradually. The child individuates, differentiates, begins to know where the parent ends and they begin. In toxic family systems, this second birth is prevented, sometimes through overt control, surveillance, punishment, the crushing of any sign of independent thought. More often through subtle mechanisms. Guilt, the performance of fragility, the message that your differentiation would destroy them, that to become yourself is to commit murder. The cost is invisible but total. You remain a psychic extension of your parents, living out their unlived lives, carrying their disowned emotions, functioning as a character in their internal drama rather than the protagonist of your own life. This is not a developmental delay you can simply outgrow. It's a structural problem requiring conscious intervention. Because the family system has a vested interest in keeping you contained. Your continued fusion stabilizes everyone else's denial, and someone in the family has been chosen to ensure that nothing changes, to carry the weight of what everyone refuses to see. In every family system built on denial, someone must carry what everyone else refuses to acknowledge. The rage no one admits to feeling. The shame no one will claim as their own. The dysfunction everyone agrees to call normal. That person becomes the identified patient, the problem child, the scapegoat. This term originated in family systems theory in the 1950s with Gregory Bateson's work on family homeostasis. He observed a pattern: when a family system accumulates too much painful feeling, too much conflict, too much anxiety, too much unmetabolized trauma, one member gets unconsciously designated as the source of all difficulty. Not because they cause the problems, but because labeling them as the problem allows everyone else to avoid looking at the actual structure. The mechanism is called projective identification, and it operates with surgical precision. The parent, usually unconsciously, exports unbearable parts of themselves onto the child. Rage they can't own, shame they refuse to feel, weakness they've spent a lifetime denying. These psychic toxins get pushed into the child through 1,000 micro-interactions, contemptuous looks, dismissive tones, the atmosphere of disgust that saturates ordinary moments. And then the child is forced to identify with these projections, forced to believe this shadow material is who they actually are. Psychology today describes it clearly. When we scapegoat, we project what is dark, shameful, and denied about ourselves onto others. This shadow side of our personality represents hidden or wounded aspects, the thing a person has no wish to be. The scapegoat serves the miserable role of carrying the unconscious shadow parts of the parent. You grow up believing the family's toxicity lives in you, that you're the angry one, the damaged one, the one who can't let things go. Meanwhile, the person raging at you for your anger remains convinced of their own calm. The person shaming you for your sensitivity never examines their own emotional shutdown. The projection is complete. This is not random selection. Scapegoats often possess qualities that threaten the family system: perceptiveness, emotional honesty, a refusal to participate in collective delusion. These aren't deficits, they're exactly what makes you dangerous to a structure built on lies. And here's the paradox that Jung understood. The scapegoat, precisely because they're forced into this outsider position, often becomes the most psychologically aware member of the family. They see what others deny. They feel what the family has agreed not to feel. Their symptoms, the anxiety, the hypervigilance, the sense of being fundamentally wrong, aren't evidence of pathology. They're signals, evidence that something in the system is profoundly broken. Family systems therapists recognize this dynamic. The identified patient is often an emissary from the family to the wider world, an implicit call for help from a system that can't acknowledge its own distress. The person bearing the symptoms is actually the one most in touch with reality. You feel the wrongness in your body, the way your chest tightens when you're around them, the dissociation that creeps in during family gatherings, that sense of watching yourself from a distance, your mind going blank mid-conversation, the hours or days it takes to feel solid again after contact. This isn't weakness. This is your nervous system accurately registering threat. The scapegoat archetype appears across cultures, across time, the figure sacrificed to atone for the sins of the collective. In Jungian terms, this person carries the group shadow, becomes the container for everything the family cannot consciously hold. They're simultaneously feared, despised, and secretly needed, because without someone to blame, the entire structure collapses. And this is why your healing feels like such a threat to them. Why setting boundaries triggers rage, why your absence destabilizes the system, You were never supposed to see the mechanism. You were supposed to keep believing the problem was you. But the scapegoat role is maintained through something even more insidious than projection. It's sustained through a psychological fusion so complete that you can't tell where your family ends and you begin. Jung borrowed a term from anthropologist Lucien Lévy-Bruhl to describe the most fundamental bond between child and parent: participation mystique, a peculiar kind of psychological connection where the subject cannot clearly distinguish themselves from the object, where the boundary between self and other dissolves into something closer to identity than relationship. In healthy development, this fusion is temporary, natural. The infant exists inside the mother's psyche, psychologically merged with the environment, experiencing the parent's emotional reality as absolute truth. There is no you yet, only the psychic weather you're born into. Jung described it precisely. The child is psychologically more or less identical with its environment, and especially with its parents. You don't experience your mother's anxiety as her anxiety. You experience it as the texture of reality itself. Her contempt becomes your worthlessness. His rage becomes the fundamental instabilities of the world. You're not observing their emotions, you're living inside them. This is participation mystique. And in functional families, the child gradually emerges from this merged state into separateness, into selfhood. In toxic families, this emergence is prevented. The fusion is enforced. You can feel it in your body, the way you can't distinguish your own feelings from theirs. A parent is upset, and suddenly your chest constricts even though nothing has happened to you directly. They're anxious, and your nervous system floods with cortisol. They need you to perform happiness, and you find yourself smiling, performing, your own emotional reality completely submerged beneath the demand to stabilize theirs. Jung connected participation mystique directly to relational suffering. He observed that when people complain of constant conflict with those they love, terrible scenes, resistances, the inability to be in the same room without drama, you'll find they've been living in participation mystique. They've spread themselves over other people until they've become identical with them. And this, Jung said, is a violation of the principle of individuality. You can't have a relationship with someone you're fused with. You can only have enmeshment, codependence, the exhausting work of managing someone else's inner world, while your own remains unexamined, unknown, submerged. Analyst Daryl Sharp describes the trap. Participation mystique can feel good for a while. The merger. The sense of belonging so complete there's no gap, no separateness, no aloneness. But in the long run, it doesn't work. It can't. Because symbiosis, identification, and fusion prevent the very thing that makes relationship possible. Two distinct selves, choosing connection rather than being compelled into it by unconscious fusion. In toxic families, this fusion serves a function. If you can't distinguish your feelings from your mother's, you'll regulate her nervous system automatically. If you can't tell where your father ends and you begin, you'll absorb his shame without him ever having to consciously confront it. Your very lack of selfhood becomes the family's stabilizing force. This is what makes separation feel like death, because psychologically, it is. You're not just leaving people. You're attempting to emerge from a merged state that's been mistaken for reality itself. The terror isn't irrational. It's the primitive fear of a psyche trying to individuate from the only container it's ever known. And participation mystique doesn't exist in isolation. It's maintained and reinforced through something even more specific, a system of assigned roles that lock everyone into position and ensure nothing changes. Participation mystique doesn't maintain itself through abstract psychological forces. It's sustained through something concrete, assigned roles that distribute the family's unconscious material and ensure everyone stays locked in position. You were cast in your role before you had language, before memory, before you could consent to or refuse the part you'd play in the family drama. The golden child receives the positive projections. They're competent, strong, logical, the repository of the family's idealized self-image. But beneath the surface, therapist Terry Real observes, they're in what he calls a slave god position, false empowerment that leaves them struggling with dependency, vulnerability, and joy. They're allowed power, but only the kind that serves the family's need to believe in its own excellence. Step outside that function, and the pedestal becomes a trap door. The scapegoat carries the negative projections. They're the problem, the difficult one, the source of family dysfunction. Real identifies their position as slave demon, possessing power only through remaining bad, troubled, resistant. But here's what the family can't acknowledge. The scapegoat is often the one trying to bring to the surface all the pathology and truth being denied and suppressed. They're not creating the dysfunction, they're making it visible. The lost child becomes invisible, self-erasing. They learn early that survival means taking up no space, needing nothing, disappearing into the wallpaper of family life. The mascot breaks tension through humor, deflection, performance. They can never be serious, can never stop entertaining. Their emotional reality gets buried beneath the compulsion to keep everyone comfortable. The parentified child is forced into adult responsibilities before their psyche is developed enough to handle them. They become the emotional caretaker, the mediator, the one managing the parent's marriage or the sibling's distress. Childhood gets sacrificed to maintain the system's stability. These roles emerge from what Jung described as the family shadow. The Society of Analytical Psychology explains the mechanism. From infancy through adolescence, you absorb conscious and unconscious messages about what's acceptable in your family. Everything deemed unacceptable gets suppressed, repressed, becomes part of the shadow. And in families that engage in splitting, dividing the world into absolutes of good and bad, children get sorted into camps accordingly. One child becomes the good one, another becomes the bad one. Siblings get pitted against each other to create allies and scapegoats, ensuring no unified front can challenge the parent's authority. You can feel your role in the tightness that overtakes your body when you try to step outside it. The golden child who admits struggle and watches their family's face close. The scapegoat who achieves something and receives silence instead of celebration. The lost child who asks for attention and feels the room's energy shift toward discomfort. Your deviation from the assigned script registers as threat. The roles serve parental complexes, the unconscious needs and wounds the parents never metabolized. Your assigned position isn't about who you are. It's about what the family system needs to maintain its equilibrium. You're playing a character in their internal drama, carrying feelings and qualities they can't consciously hold. And this is why refusing your role destabilizes everything. When you step out of position, when the scapegoat stops accepting blame, when the golden child admits imperfection, when the lost child demands to be seen, the entire toxic system begins to crumble. The smoke and mirrors used to deflect responsibility get revealed. Often, what happens next is predictable. The system scrambles to restore equilibrium. A new scapegoat gets chosen. The golden child suddenly falls from grace. The panic is palpable because the family's psychological survival has depended on these roles remaining fixed. Setting boundaries activates the amygdala's fear response. Your brain interprets boundary setting as a survival risk when family acceptance has been tied to compliance, to staying in role, to sacrificing yourself for the system's stability. But these roles didn't originate with your parents. They're carrying something too. Something that travels through bloodlines and shapes lives across generations before anyone becomes conscious enough to name it. The roles you've been assigned, the shadow you've been forced to carry, the fusion that keeps you psychologically imprisoned, none of this began with your parents. They're transmitting something they inherited, something that travels through bloodlines like a psychological contagion, shaping lives across generations before anyone becomes conscious enough to interrupt it. Jung understood this through his concept of the collective unconscious, a layer of psyche that comprises the psychic life of our ancestors right back to the earliest beginnings. But contemporary neuroscience has given us the mechanism: epigenetics, the study of how environmental experiences alter gene expression without changing the DNA sequence itself. Trauma researcher Rachel Yehuda studied children of Holocaust survivors and discovered something startling. These children, who never experienced the camps themselves, showed altered stress hormone levels and heightened anxiety patterns nearly identical to their parents. The body remembers what the mind never knew. DNA can hold memory of traumatic experiences and pass them forward through cellular inheritance. This isn't metaphor, it's biology in conversation with psychology. What you're carrying isn't just your parents' unresolved pain. It's your grandparents' unmetabolized grief, your great-grandparents' survival strategies, patterns of attachment, styles of relating, emotional responses to threat. All of it transmitted through what family therapist Judy Wilkins Smith calls emotional DNA, a legacy scripted by ancestors that subconsciously dictates decisions, shapes relationships, determines what feels safe and what feels like annihilation. Psychoanalyst Galit Atlas writes in Emotional Inheritance that the people who raised us live inside us. We experience their emotional pain. We dream their memories. These things shape our lives in ways we don't recognize because we mistake inherited patterns for our own personality, ancestral trauma for our own sensitivity, someone else's unlived life for our calling. Jung stated it with devastating clarity. The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents, not their lived failures, their unlived potential, the dreams they abandoned, the selves they refused to become, the emotions they couldn't metabolize. All of it gets deposited into the child like toxic waste into a landfill. The International Association for Analytical Psychology confirms this transgenerational transmission. Parents often cast their shadow on their children, and this passing down of the unlived and unconscious, including traumatic experiences, noticeably complicates the adult lives of the offspring. You're not just healing your own wounds, you're metabolizing pain that predates your birth. The family unconscious, a concept developed by therapist E.B. Bynum, sits between Freud's personal unconscious and Jung's collective unconscious. It's the psychic field shared by family members, modified by those who participate in it, but also exerting pressure on each individual to conform, to carry, to enact the unfinished business of the lineage. When this transmission goes uninterrupted, it creates what clinicians call major disruptions to the unfolding individuation process. Your life force gets contracted into symptomology, anxiety, depression, chronic illness, relationship patterns that replicate ancestral failures. Or it gets diverted into unconsciously acting out the family myth, living a script written generations before you were born. And here's what makes this devastating. You can feel it, but you can't see it. The inherited anxiety that floods your system in situations your parents never directly warned you about. The rage that feels outsized to the present moment because it's carrying decades of unexpressed anger. The shame that adheres to your skin like a second epidermis, internalized before you had words. Absorbed through the emotional atmosphere of a household still processing traumas from 2, 3, 4 generations back. But generational trauma also means generational potential for healing. When you become conscious of these patterns, when you name the abuse, the neglect, the secrecy that's been normalized across generations, you become the point where the cycle can break. Not through willpower, not through positive thinking, through the difficult, relentless work of making unconscious material conscious. You may be the first person in your lineage brave enough or broken enough to refuse enactment, to say no to the script, to choose consciousness over compliance. And that choice has a cost, because staying embedded in these patterns, continuing to play your assigned role, comes with a price most people never calculate until it's already been paid. Most people focus on the cost of leaving, the guilt, the grief, the social judgment. But there's a price rarely calculated, what it costs to stay embedded in a family system that requires your psychological death as the price of belonging. Jung had a term for what happens when the ego remains dominated by complexes and collective pressures, when individuation fails and the person becomes more object than subject. He called it desindividuation, not the absence of individuation, the active destruction of it. The psyche collapsing inward, ruled by autonomous energies it can't recognize or resist. You can feel it happening. The way you become someone else around them. Not performing a role consciously, but disappearing into it so completely you lose access to your own thoughts mid-conversation. The hours or days it takes after contact to remember who you are. The chronic fatigue that has no medical explanation. The autoimmune conditions, the migraines, the gut issues that flare in response to family stress, the body keeping score in the only language it has. This is what enmeshment architecture looks like from the inside. Not closeness, fusion, a dysfunctional pattern characterized by blurred or non-existent boundaries where individual identity gets lost or minimized in favor of collective family identity. Personal space becomes a violation of loyalty. Independent decisions become acts of betrayal. Differences get demonized as proof of your defectiveness. In these systems, contact doesn't nourish, it depletes. You give and give and give, regulating everyone else's nervous system while your own slides into chronic dysregulation. You manage their emotions, absorb their projections, carry their shadow, all while being told you're selfish for having needs of your own. Psychologists Heller and Lapierre describe what happens developmentally. When healthy natural aggression and self-expression get short-circuited through lack of attunement, abuse, or neglect, they become coupled with fear, shame, and guilt. The separation-individuation process gets disrupted. Children fail to psychologically individuate. They remain fused. Their sense of self conditional on the family's approval, their internal world colonized by external demands. Murray Bowen described this fusion state precisely. Individual choices get set aside in service of achieving harmony. The person reacts immediately to the perceived emotions of others, like a reflex, with no gap for conscious choice. This is regression, behavioral backtracking to earlier coping mechanisms. And when sustained over years, it produces chronic depression, codependence, anxiety that resists every therapeutic intervention because the source isn't in you. It's in the system you're still trying to survive. Trauma psychologist Donald Kalshed identified what happens to people who remain in destructive environments. They lead a false, generic life instead of a true, personal one. Unable to feel fully alive, especially in intimate relationships. The potential for aliveness lies dormant, like a seed waiting to be awakened, but against great resistances. Because the family system has a vested interest in keeping it dormant, and your brain cooperates with this imprisonment. Neural pathways form early. Self-sacrifice equals love. Boundaries equal abandonment. Your needs equal danger. These aren't beliefs you can simply think your way out of. They're wired into your nervous system's threat detection apparatus. When you try to set a boundary, your amygdala fires as if you're facing physical death. Because in the logic of your childhood nervous system, emotional abandonment by the family was death. So you stay, you accommodate, you minimize. You tell yourself it's not that bad, that they're trying, that you're too sensitive. And year by year, the self that might have emerged, the one with preferences, desires, boundaries, a life organized around internal truth rather than external approval, remains unborn. This is the cost, not dramatic, not visible, just the slow erosion of personhood until you're living out someone else's unconscious script, a character in their drama, a function in their system. But there's a moment when the self, that deeper organizing principle Jung distinguished from the ego, issues a command that can't be ignored. When staying becomes psychologically impossible and leaving becomes not choice but imperative. There comes a moment when the cost of staying exceeds the terror of leaving, when your body refuses one more family gathering, one more performance of normal, one more erasure of your reality, when something deeper than ego, something Jung called the self, issues a command you can't ignore. This isn't the small self, not the you that navigates daily life, makes decisions, manages relationships. Jung distinguished the self with a capital S as the organizing center of the entire psyche, encompassing both conscious and unconscious, the totality of who you are, not just who you've learned to be. He described it as both the center and the whole circumference, the archetype of wholeness itself. And the self has an agenda that often conflicts with the ego's desire for safety, belonging, social acceptance. The self demands truth, authenticity, individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are, rather than who the family system, the culture, the collective needs you to be. When the self constellates strongly, you experience an inner no that overrides every external pressure to comply. Your family demands you show up for another holiday. Your ego calculates the social cost of refusal. But the self responds with something deeper than decision, a bodily revulsion, a psychic refusal so fundamental it feels less like choice and more like organism-level self-preservation. This is not abandonment. This is the self protecting what Jung called the sacred and imperishable aspect of human spirit, when the external environment has become incompatible with psychological survival. Trauma psychologist Donald Kalsched observed that when we're given more to experience than we can consciously bear, the psyche responds by dissociating, protecting something essential in the inner world. But the mechanism designed to preserve you can also imprison you, attacking self-esteem, generating a dark sense of inadequacy, keeping you small. Sometimes, Kalsched notes, the psyche prioritizes survival over wholeness. Surviving in pieces becomes necessary for deeper integration to occur later. Estrangement can be that necessary fragmentation, the choice to survive now, psychologically, emotionally, sometimes physically, so that wholeness becomes possible in the future. Clinical psychotherapist Jody Gale frames it clearly. Going no contact is often a trauma-informed boundary chosen after years of emotional neglect, narcissistic abuse, or toxic relationships. Estrangement becomes a path to trauma recovery, nervous system regulation, clarity, self-protection when repair is no longer possible. The data supports this reframe. In a Cambridge University study conducted with Stand Alone, 80% of estranged adults reported positive outcomes, greater feelings of freedom and independence, personal growth, healing, the discovery of who they are outside the family's distorting mirror. Many reported that estrangement saved them from suicide. That distance allowed them to finally become real. This is individuation in its most literal form. Becoming an individual, undivided, whole within yourself, no longer split between the self the family demands and the self that wants to live. But Jung also understood the ethical dimension. He distinguished what family systems theorist Murray Bowen later called growing away versus cutoff. Growing away means following independent goals while recognizing your place in the family system. Differentiation without denial. Cutoff involves denial of attachments, relieving immediate pressure but leaving unconscious patterns unchanged. The difference is consciousness. Reactive cutoff keeps you bound to what you're fleeing. Conscious separation creates space for genuine psychological work, the slow, difficult process of withdrawing projections, establishing boundaries, reparenting the parts of you that were never allowed to develop. Sometimes a period of complete cutoff is necessary before any healthy contact becomes possible. Sometimes the system is so toxic that distance must be permanent. There's no universal prescription. Only the self's imperative, which you feel in your body as clearly as hunger or exhaustion. The culture will call it abandonment. Your family will call it cruelty. But Jung understood what most psychology still resists. There are moments when obedience to the self requires what looks like disloyalty to everything external. When the only way to honor your own psychological development is to refuse the role, leave the stage, exit the theater entirely. Estrangement is the beginning, not the end, because leaving the external family doesn't automatically dissolve the internal one. The real work happens after separation, in the territory of your own psyche, where the parents still live as internal figures and the assigned roles still operate as unconscious commands. You've left. You've created distance. You've stopped answering the calls, stopped attending the gatherings, stopped performing the role that was never yours to begin with. And you discover something unsettling. The family still lives inside you. Separation from the external family doesn't automatically dissolve the internalized parental imago, those psychological representations of mother and father that Jung distinguished from the actual people. The inner critical voice continues operating. The shame that adheres to your skin when you prioritize your own needs. The guilt that floods your system when you say no. These aren't coming from outside anymore. They're internal structures, habits of psyche, patterns so deeply wired they feel like identity itself. This is where the real work begins, not in the drama of leaving, but in the slow, unglamorous process of reparenting yourself. Jung introduced the divine child archetype as a symbol of renewal and transformation, the potential for new beginnings held within the psyche. But for those who grew up in toxic families, the inner child isn't divine. It's wounded, terrified, convinced of its own wrongness. And it's still waiting for the parent who never came. Reparenting means becoming that parent. Not in the pop psychology sense of self-care Sundays and bubble baths, in the structural sense of developing an internal good parent stance, a capacity for self-compassion, protection, and guidance that the external family couldn't reliably provide. Therapist Lucia Capacchione outlines the process. Recognize the critical inner parent's voice and where it originated. Create a nurturing and protective internal parent to counter it. Address the physical, emotional, creative, and spiritual needs that were neglected in childhood. This isn't metaphor. It's active psychological work, dialoguing with the inner child through journaling, meditation, visualization, hearing what that part has to tell you. What it needed then. What it still needs now. The CPTSD Foundation describes it as giving yourself what you didn't receive in childhood. All the love, respect, and dignity you deserved when you were young. The validation that your feelings were real. The permission to have needs. The assurance that your existence isn't conditional on others' comfort. This work has 3 core movements. Connect. Acknowledge the child within, because healing can't begin as long as this part remains unnoticed, exiled to the basement of your psyche. Communicate. Hear what the inner child has to say, what it experienced, what it still carries. Nurture. Step into the role of exactly the parent this part needed, firm when it needs protection, gentle when it needs comfort, present when it needs witness. And this internal work must be accompanied by external architecture. Boundaries. Not the walls people accuse you of building. Boundaries as the practical dismantling of participation mystique. The dissolution of that unconscious fusion where you can't distinguish your feelings from theirs, your needs from their demands, your reality from their narrative. Analyst Daryl Sharp describes the shift. When you're psychologically separate, not identified with another person, you don't need them to agree with you. You don't need to be right. You can hold your own reality alongside theirs without collapsing into fusion or escalating into war. There's an optimum distance in every relationship that evolves through trial and error and goodwill, if you know who you are. That last clause is crucial. If you know who you are. Boundaries require a self to defend, and for many who grew up as scapegoats, as identified patients, as carriers of family shadow, that self is still under construction. Boundaries feel impossible because you're not sure what's yours to protect. This is where withdrawing projections becomes essential. Jung observed that we naively suppose people are as we imagine them to be. All the contents of our unconscious get constantly projected into our surroundings. And it's only by recognizing certain properties of objects as projections that we can distinguish them from real properties. With parents, this means the painful process of seeing them not as gods or demons, but as limited, wounded humans, capable of harm without being monsters, worthy of compassion without being owed your psychological sacrifice. Jungian analyst Marie-Louise von Franz identified 5 stages in projection withdrawal, noting that it always results in psychological crisis, but has as its reward self-knowledge. You discover you can save yourself. Be finally free from the trappings of dependent childhood. Murray Bowen called this differentiation of self, the ability to think as an individual while staying meaningfully connected to others. Not fusion, where you become enmeshed with others' emotions and needs. Not cut off, where you flee to create the illusion of independence, but actual psychological separateness, maintaining your own center while relating to theirs. The process involves conscious effort at strengthening what Bowen called solid self, defining your beliefs and principles, managing anxiety and reactivity, relating differently to the family system even when the family hasn't changed, and your brain will resist this work. Neural pathways formed in childhood equate self-sacrifice with love, boundaries with abandonment. When you prioritize your needs, guilt fires like a threat response. This isn't moral failing, it's conditioning. And it changes through repetition. New behaviors creating new neural pathways until what once felt like betrayal begins to feel like integrity. But individual healing, as profound as it is, contains a dimension most people miss. Something Jung understood that transforms estrangement from personal act to mythic one. Jung emphasized something most approaches to healing miss. Individuation is personal, but it's never merely individual. The person who becomes more conscious affects the whole field, not through evangelizing or forcing change on others, but through the simple fact of their transformation rippling outward in ways they may never directly witness. When you refuse to carry the family shadow, when you break contact if necessary and build a different life, you're not just saving yourself, you're potentially liberating future generations from the compulsory repetition of the same trauma patterns. Therapist Josephine Hardman describes the mechanism, a process of individuation, an energetic separation between you and your family must occur. You're recognizing the importance of becoming your own person and aligning with your higher self. And this creates an opportunity for future generations in your family to manifest their lives consciously, instead of living out these unconscious contracts as well. The family unconscious, that psychic field shared by all members, gets modified by those who participate in it. When one person becomes conscious, when they refuse enactment of inherited patterns, the entire field shifts. Not always visibly, not always immediately, but the possibility emerges that wasn't there before. Think of it like this: you may be the first person in your lineage to name the abuse as abuse, to call the neglect what it actually was, to refuse to minimize or excuse what happened. That act of naming, of consciousness, creates a rupture in the seamless transmission of denial across generations. Your children, if you have them, won't inherit the same unconscious mandate to carry what you carried. The cycle doesn't continue automatically. This is what Jung meant when he said individuation serves the collective, not through conformity to collective norms, but through the individual becoming more fully themselves and thereby contributing something new, something conscious to the collective psyche. He warned against one-sided individuation, becoming so focused on personal development that you abandon connection to others entirely. But he equally warned against one-sided conformity, which destroys the soul. The goal is differentiation that enables genuine relation, becoming psychologically separate so that real connection becomes possible. Not fusion masquerading as love, but two whole selves choosing each other rather than being compelled into unconscious enmeshment. Jungian analyst Marion Woodman emphasized this collective dimension. The individual who undertakes deep psychological work contributes to the transformation of the entire culture. The reclaiming of what's been repressed and denied isn't just personal healing, it's essential for collective healing. You become the nodal point where the old story ends and a new pattern begins, not through perfection, not through never struggling, but through the willingness to make unconscious material conscious, to name what was unnamed, to choose truth over the comfort of collective denial. And this comes with a paradox Jung understood deeply. Separation can enable relationship in ways fusion never could. When you're no longer psychologically fused with your family, if contact becomes possible again, it can occur between two differentiated selves rather than between roles in an unconscious drama. 1 + 1 doesn't equal 1, the merger model. It equals 3. Two separate beings whose relationship forms a third entity that obliges them to stretch beyond their individual limitations. Sometimes that relationship remains impossible. Sometimes the family system is too invested in its structure to tolerate your wholeness. And that's the tragic dimension. Choosing yourself may mean permanent distance from people you once loved, or still love despite everything. But wholeness was never about achieving perfect connection with everyone. It's about integrity, the word itself meaning undivided. Becoming whole within yourself, even if it means standing alone, living from the self rather than the persona, building a life organized around internal truth rather than external approval. This is hard work, some of the hardest work a person can do. You're not just healing yourself, you're metabolizing ancestral trauma, refusing inherited scripts, pioneering a path no one in your lineage has walked before, and the culture won't celebrate you for it. Your family won't thank you. There's no medal for breaking generational cycles, no social recognition for the quiet, relentless work of becoming psychologically separate. But you'll know, in the way your body relaxes when you're no longer performing, in the capacity to feel joy without waiting for permission, in the slow emergence of preferences, desires, thoughts that are actually yours, in the relationships you build with people who see you rather than the role you've been assigned. You're not abandoning your family, you're becoming yourself. And sometimes the house of shadows must be left for psychological birth to occur. Thank you for exploring this with me. If this resonated, if you recognized yourself or someone you love in these patterns, I invite you to like and subscribe. This work deepens when we're not alone in it. Share this with someone who might recognize themselves here, and leave a comment with your reflections. What role did you play in your family system? What did it cost you to stay or to leave? Your story matters. Thank you for doing this consciousness work. See you in the next exploration.